The movie begins by featuring a former homicide detective named Roy Freeman. Sometime after his retirement, Roy was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. Due to his condition, he has to take medication regularly. The disease also resulted in the impairment of his memory. One day, Roy met a woman named Emily Dietz, who worked as a lawyer. During the meeting, Emily revealed that she was representing her client, a prisoner named Isaac Samuel. Roy handled Isaac's case 10 years ago. Due to his Alzheimer's, Roy did not remember Isaac Samuel at all. However, Emily patiently tried to explain little by little about her client. She explained that Samuel had served a 10-year prison sentence for the murder of a professor named Joseph Veeder. Because of the case, Samuel was scheduled to be executed at the end of the month. Emily came to see Roy at the request of Samuel, who wanted to convey a message that Roy was willing to see him before the execution took place. The next day, Roy went to the prison to see Samuel. There, Samuel confirmed that he was not the perpetrator of the murder of Professor Joseph Veeder. He admitted that he was forced to sign a confession letter to the police at that time because he was unable to survive after receiving a lot of pressure. On the night of the incident 10 years ago, Samuel said he intended to meet Professor Joseph Veeder. However, before he could meet the professor, someone suddenly entered the house and hit Professor Joseph repeatedly. Samuel, who was terrified, could only hide behind the wall without daring to see who the murderer was. Roy did not immediately believe the confession. Samuel tried to convince Roy and asked him to meet someone named Richard Finn. Richard is a book writer who had met with Samuel a few months earlier to rewrite the story of Professor Joseph Veeder's murder. After talking with Samuel, Roy reopened the case file of Professor Joseph Veeder's death. Accidentally, he found a file with the name Richard Finn, whose examination file was signed by Roy's former colleague at the time, Jimmy Remies. To rebuild his memory of the case, Roy decides to meet Jimmy Remies. Roy revealed that he now had Alzheimer's and could not remember anything, including Jimmy, who was his colleague. Roy then explained that he had met Isaac Samuel, whose case they had worked on 10 years ago. Roy also mentioned Richard Finn's file, where many of Richard's fingerprints were found at the crime scene. However, at that time, Richard Finn claimed not to have been there when Professor Joseph Veeder was killed. After hearing his friend's complaints, Jimmy promised to find Richard Finn's whereabouts.
There.
Later that night, Roy found a picture of his wedding in a frame. However, the glass of the frame has been broken, so Roy's wife's face is no longer clearly visible. Shortly after, Roy receives a call from Jimmy informing him that he has found Richard Finn, but unfortunately, Richard is dead. According to the report file, Richard died from an overdose. However, when Roy examined Richard's arm, he only found one syringe mark, indicating that Richard was not a drug addict. In addition, when Roy saw Richard's face, he began to remember that he had seen Richard present at the crime scene when the police searched Professor Joseph Veeder's house 10 years ago. Long story short, while attending Richard's funeral, Roy met Richard's younger brother, Eddie. According to Eddie, his brother had recently been compiling a paper on the death of Professor Joseph Veeder. Eddie also revealed that Richard often looked restless after finishing his writing. However, Eddie emphasized that his brother was not a drug addict. Later that evening, Roy began reading Richard's book, which he had gotten from Eddie. In the writing, Richard tells about a time when he attended an event on campus and accidentally met a beautiful woman named Laura Baines. At the event, Laura explained that she was an advanced student in the psychology department and was working on her thesis under the guidance of Professor Joseph Veeder. Since that introduction, Richard and Laura's relationship has grown closer. A few months later, Richard received news that his father had passed away due to a heart attack, and his mother could no longer afford to pay for Richard's education. It was at this time that Richard first met Professor Joseph Veeder through Laura's connection, who intended to help Richard continue his education at the college. To alleviate Richard's difficulties, Professor Joseph Veeder offered him a job with a hefty salary. From then on, Richard began working for Professor Joseph Veeder.
It's opened up. For every two-head catalog.
As time went by, Richard became suspicious of the close relationship between Laura and Professor Joseph Veeder, who seemed to have a special relationship. To make a long story short, one morning, when Richard went to Professor Joseph Veeder's residence for work, he found that the house was filled with police officers because Professor Joseph Veeder was found dead in his home. After Professor Joseph Veeder's death, Richard continued his career as a writer while Laura disappeared into thin air. After reading Richard's writing, Roy decided to meet Jimmy to discuss his findings regarding the death of Professor Joseph Veeder. According to Roy, Laura's figure was very suspicious because she had suddenly disappeared since the professor's death, as well as Professor Joseph Veeder's assistant Wayne. This made Roy even more curious. Therefore, Roy revealed to Jimmy that he intended to meet Richard's ex-wife, Dana. The next day, Roy went to see Richard's ex-wife, Dana. To Roy, Dana emphasized that Richard did not have an addiction. In fact, Dana suspected Richard's death had something to do with a woman named Elizabeth. According to Dana, before Richard was found dead, he had communicated with Elizabeth over the phone. Dana is even convinced that Elizabeth is the one who killed Richard. When Roy looks for information related to someone named Elizabeth, he surprisingly finds that the figure is Laura, who has changed her name to Elizabeth. When Roy meets Elizabeth, the woman immediately recognizes Roy and admits that they had met briefly, although Roy still has difficulty remembering it. Before leaving, Roy gives a copy of Richard's writing, which tells about the death of Professor Joseph Veeder.
I was wondering if you would like to have a look at it.
After meeting Elizabeth aka Laura, Roy looked for the address of Wayne, Professor Joseph Veeder's assistant, to find out more information about the case. According to Wayne, Professor Joseph Veeder helped him a lot, one of which was giving him a job after he was no longer active as a soldier. In Wayne's eyes, Professor Joseph Veeder was a man of many acquaintances and connections. When asked about Laura, Wayne only knew that Laura was Professor Joseph Veeder's laboratory assistant. However, Wayne revealed that Professor Joseph Veeder was known to have relationships with many women. In fact, Professor Joseph Veeder has an extensive collection of recordings of his relationships with women, one of which is a woman named Diane Lynch, a bartender at a cafe. After meeting Wayne, Roy reopens Professor Joseph Veeder's murder case file and writes Diane Lynch's name as the next person he will question. Roy also found an irregularity, namely that the entire case file of Professor Joseph Veeder's case was only signed by Jimmy Remies, his partner, even though they handled the case together 10 years ago. While Roy was seriously examining the files, someone suddenly knocked on his door, and it turned out to be Laura. Unbeknownst to both of them, Jimmy was watching Laura's arrival. In front of Roy, Laura reveals that the book Richard wrote is just nonsense because she doesn't feel that she has ever been in contact with Richard. Long story short, after Laura went home, Roy, who was watching TV, suddenly felt hungry, but the food supply in the refrigerator had run out. Finally, that night, Roy left the house on foot to look for food. As he was walking alone, a car suddenly sped up from behind and was about to hit him. Finding himself threatened, Roy, who was carrying a gun at the time, immediately fired several shots at the car. As it turned out, Wayne was driving the car, and he was killed instantly. Although the police interrogated Roy, he was eventually released because the CCTV footage showed that he was only defending himself. The following day, Roy was seen heading to a cafe with the intention of meeting Diane, who, according to Wayne, worked as a bartender there. However, upon arrival at the cafe, Roy found that the place had changed bartenders, as Diane had passed away 5 years ago. Roy then went to Professor Joseph Veeder's residence. Upon entering the house, Roy's memories began to faintly emerge regarding the conditions of the crime scene 10 years ago. Roy remembered that Professor Joseph Veeder was killed by a baseball bat that the professor used to keep in the garage. When the police inspected Professor Joseph Veeder's residence 10 years ago, one baseball bat was not found in its place, and the police failed to find it. However, Roy recalled that he saw a shovel hanging in the garage, which still had dirt on the end. With the help of a wire he found in the garage, Roy began searching for loose soil in the backyard by poking the end of the wire. After trying several times in different places, Roy finally found the part of the ground that he suspected was the place to bury the baseball bat. Roy then started digging until he finally found the baseball bat he had been looking for. As Roy was observing the stick, Laura suddenly appeared and asked what Roy had seen there. Jimmy also appeared and immediately asked Roy to enter the house while carrying a gun in his right hand. When Roy asked Jimmy about all this, his former partner explained that he had only cleaned up all the mess that had happened all this time. Jimmy also tried to remind Roy about Diane Lynch, but Roy couldn't remember her. When Roy suspects that Jimmy and Laura have known each other before, Laura begins to tell her story. According to Laura's confession, she didn't know Jimmy, but after the murder of Professor Joseph Veeder, they knew each other. At that time, Jimmy started asking about Laura's relationship with Professor Joseph Veeder. Not wanting to be bothered with questions and feeling uninvolved, Laura decided to disappear and changed her name to Elizabeth. However, after a while, Laura's new identity was finally discovered by Richard, who then reported her to Jimmy and accused Laura of being the murderer of Professor Joseph Veeder. Laura then revealed that Jimmy had contacted her and blackmailed her to keep her name out of the case. Hearing Laura's confession, Jimmy immediately denied it. Jimmy actually called Laura good at manipulating people, and he warned Roy not to fall for Laura's story. Jimmy also revealed that Laura was the one who killed Richard by accusing Richard of being the murderer of Professor Joseph Veeder and using Wayne. Because of Laura's incitement, Wayne, who felt he had a lot of debt to Professor Joseph, lost control and immediately injected drugs into Richard's body. Not only that, Jimmy was convinced that Laura was also the one who asked Wayne to run over Roy some time ago. However, before Jimmy could speak further, Laura suddenly shot him from the side. Despite being shot, Jimmy still managed to get back at Laura by shooting her back. A few days after it was revealed who the real culprit behind the death of Professor Joseph Veeder was, based on Roy's testimony, Samuel was finally released from the death penalty for all the deeds he did not actually commit. After the mystery of Professor Joseph Veeder's death was revealed, Roy began to remove the photo files that he had attached to his wall one by one. However, when Roy tried to remove the broken glass on his wedding photo frame, he began to remember an incident when Laura had met him at a cafe. At that time, Laura informed him that his wife had betrayed him by having a relationship with Professor Joseph Veeder, who happened to be his wife's psychiatrist at the time. At first, Roy doesn't believe Laura's story, but Laura gives him a videotape entitled Diane Lynch. It is only then that Roy remembers that Diane Lynch is his wife. Although Roy had tried to forgive his wife in the past, his wife, who felt guilty, preferred to leave Roy. After his wife decided to leave, at night, Roy went to Professor Joseph Veeder's house while carrying a baseball bat in his right hand. When he saw Professor Joseph Veeder, Roy immediately hit the professor until he fell. After that, he swung the baseball bat many times. However, before Roy could go any further, Jimmy came to stop him. Jimmy then dug up the soil in the backyard of Professor Joseph Veeder's house to remove the evidence that Roy used to kill Professor Joseph Veeder. Indeed, the fate of Jimmy and Laura is very tragic in this story. The two people who actually intended to help Roy had to face a very sad end. Jimmy, who was trying to cover up Roy's past and help him free Samuel, unknowingly got caught up in an increasingly complicated situation and eventually died. Laura, on the other hand, despite initially suspecting Richard Finn and trying to reveal the bad behavior of Roy's wife, is also caught up in a game she never wanted to play. Indeed, if Jimmy had revealed from the beginning that Roy was the real culprit, perhaps many events could have been prevented. However, Jimmy seems to prefer to support Roy, hoping to free the innocent Samuel without further destroying Roy's life. Unfortunately, his good intentions led to his death. Laura, who feels suspicious of Roy, may also see a revenge motive behind the murder of Professor Joseph Veeder after an affair involving Roy's wife. However, instead of expressing her suspicions, she chooses to manipulate Wayne and direct him to kill Roy, although, in the end, the situation descends into chaos. All of this stems from the distrust and suspicion that develop between the characters in the story, eventually leading them to become entangled in lies and chaos. Roy, who tries to hide the truth about his past, does not realize that his actions only add to the complexities and difficulties he faces. And the movie ends.